This is Seeking Delphi, episode number 32, Reimagining Our Tomorrows with Joe Tankersly. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. We live in a cynical age. Broadcast, print, and online news sources bombard us with negative stories that often conjure up images of imminent disaster that could wreck civilization. Television and movies are full of visions of dystopian futures. And I personally, as a futurist, am amazed at the fatalistic attitudes of impending doom reflected back at me by friends and family. When it comes to the future, far too many of us have decided that it's a foregone conclusion that humanity doesn't have one. I'm not here to tell you that a better future is necessarily more likely, but one of the key missions of any serious futurist is to help individuals, organizations, and humanity as a whole steer towards preferred futures. We shouldn't take any future for granted, good or bad. One person who focuses on realistically positive stories about the future is Joe Tankersly. He spent 20 years imagining better futures with Walt Disney Imagineering, working on projects for Epcot and other Disney theme parks. He's a fellow member of the Association of Professional Futurists and, most recently and notably, author of Reimagining Our Tomorrows, Making Sure Your Future Doesn't Suck. He refers to himself as an advocate for better tomorrows. Reimagining Our Tomorrows is a compilation of stories about how various aspects of human life and society might turn out better in the foreseeable future. I recently called Joe to ask him about the book and his views. Joe, welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Well, appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Joe, you have a very interesting background, having worked for many years for Disney, and I'm just curious to know how that has colored your approach to being a futurist and how that has also influenced the writing of this book.
Oh, absolutely glad to do that, Mark. In many ways, I am an accidental futurist. I started out my professional career as a filmmaker and storyteller. And of course, I'd always been interested in stories about the future. But in late 90s, I was hired to start working for Walt Disney Imagineering here in Orlando, Florida. One of my assignments was Epcot, formerly known as the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. And as I was working on ways to keep that project updated, I really became interested in Walt Disney's visions of the future. And that led me to the World Future Society, where I discovered that there was a real disconnect between the practice of foresight and the storytelling skills that Disney had developed over the years as a way to think about the future. So that's really how I come to the whole idea of being a futurist. I was impressed by the fact that Walt understood that a good story is really the best way to get people to understand those things which tend to be abstract and hard to understand, and the future is certainly one of those.
As futurists, we frequently deal with scenarios, and you seem to have adopted the scenario approach for this book, providing a series of them in different domains of human activity. So explain to us how you arrived at that approach and adopted it for this book.
So Reimagining Our Tomorrows is a collection of what futurists would call scenarios, what everyone else would call short stories. And when I first sat down to start writing the book, I was going to write something from a more business professional point of view, describing the process I use to help groups to use storytelling and narrative as a tool to investigate the future. And I very quickly realized that what I was really interested in was just giving examples of that. So that's how the book sort of evolved from being a tutorial to being a series of examples of different scenarios of the future. The primary idea being that I wanted to just begin the conversation about what I thought were the most important topics that people were talking about today about the future, and hopefully change some of the stories that people are telling as a way to get them to think differently and think about more positive opportunities than necessarily just dystopian versions of the future.
Well, the notion of taking a more positive view of the future is not so easy in this day and age for most people because of the dystopian views that we see all the time coming out of Hollywood in television and movies. And of course, the news tends to focus on the bad things that are out there and the bad things that might affect our future. I guess disaster sells. Now, a recent film that took a different viewpoint was the movie Tomorrowland from about 4 or 5 years ago. It encouraged us to take a better view of the future, to imagine a better view of the future so that we might stave off disaster. So I'm wondering, have there been any such influences on you in terms of positive cultural views of the future, either recently or in the more distant past?
Well, for me, I have to go back pretty far in history to find those kinds of stories. And once again, because of my background, the first ones that I encountered came from Walt Disney. Back in the 1950s, he had a television series that included something he called Tomorrowland episodes. And he uh, developed a number of what he called science factuals. They were very Disney type stories about the investigation of man in space, what it would look like to go to the moon, all sorts of science and futuristic technology topics that were told through storytelling, but they were all ultimately very optimistic. And in fact, when I first encountered those, that's when I was really interested in understanding how could we replicate that idea in a more modern world that is incredibly more cynical than the 1960s were. And I've done a lot of looking for the kind of positive stories that you're talking about. And quite honestly, I see very few of them. And there's a couple of obvious reasons, I think. One is you're right, disaster sells. It's a lot easier to create drama and tension and excitement when the world is coming to an end. And we like to tell those hero myth stories. The other thing is, I think, is a collective psyche. We've just turned toward a darker vision of the future. We certainly suffer from what Alvin Toffler talked about 50 years ago in terms of future shock. And I believe that overall that psyche is really driving many of the stories that we're telling. And so we don't find many of the optimistic visions of the future anymore.
That's interesting because if you look at the objectivity of it, and this is something I discussed with Jerry Glenn from Millennium Project, discussing the most recent edition of the state of the future, that we're really doing quite well in a lot of areas, and it's really can kind of go either way. He sees it leaning a little bit more toward positive, but with a lot of challenges. So I think in your book, you've tried to look at how some of these challenges can be spun in a more favorable direction. Tell us about how you came up with some of the specific categories here, because some are obvious and maybe some are a little less obvious. The obvious ones are reimagining aging, consumerism. All right, you didn't say reimagining work, you said automation and gig economy, which are major parts of work. But then you also have, for example, reimagining suburbia and reimagining rural life. A lot of people might not put those in the highest tier. So I'm just curious how you made your selections here.
Well, I'd like to say that there was a brilliant plan behind it, but that would probably be a bit of an overstatement. Many of the topics are those topics that I get asked by clients to help them with. Certainly, things like the gig economy and aging, automation, those are very at the top of everyone's list in the professional world. Uh, Reimagining suburbia was an interesting one for me because in some of the research I have done, and I'm sure you've seen this, we're starting to see the ripple effect of the Amazonization of retail as Amazon has taken over and more retail businesses have found that they can't maintain themselves anymore. There's a prediction out right now that by the what's 2025, I believe, close to 25% of all retail malls in America will no longer be used for retail purposes. Many of them will be sitting vacant. And so I thought that would be a really interesting story to investigate. What is a positive spin on that? And of course, there's some people already doing some of stuff where they're turning them into housing projects and turning them into educational centers, all sorts of things like that. So that's where that one came from. The future of rural life was an interesting one for me because a couple of years ago, I had a client. It was actually the Cheyenne Frontier Days Rodeo, which is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a 120-year-old rodeo. which came out of left field for my practice because I had never really worked much in a rural area. And that really introduced me to what seems to be a special set of problems they face when they're thinking about the future. So I wanted to investigate that a little bit. And that's where that particular story came from, was that idea of how can we reimagine the family farm in the future? And I think there's some interesting possibilities there for us.
Joe, one thing I note is that these are individual scenarios in each of these domains. One way in which things could turn out better, in which we or you have imagined things can turn out better. Have you looked at any alternatives? Have you looked at particularly nonlinear alternatives? And the example I want to cite is aging. You depict a future for aging 15 to 20 years from now, in which we are living much healthier in later life, but not living all that much longer. Now, the potential for radical life extension is out there, and if you've been listening to my podcasts with the likes of Aubrey de Grey and David Wood, you know that there is at least some reasonable chance that this might happen. So have you looked at scenarios like that?
Oh, well, I think there are a couple of answers to that. The first one is the time horizon that I'm working in the book is 10 to maybe 20 years. So it's not 50 years, which would be, for me at least, a time horizon where I would imagine some of these extreme advances in longevity or rejuvenation might begin to be relevant conversations for topic. The second thing is I'm not trying to do a futures exercise here. I think in some ways we do ourselves a disservice when we deal with people who aren't used to the practice by immediately telling them, oh, here's 15 different versions or even 4 different possible versions of the future. What I wanted to do was definitely convince people that there were some positive opportunities to think about. I understand the risk. People might read these stories and go, well, you're saying that is the future, which of course is not my intent. My intent is to start the conversation. What I hope is that people might read The Future of Aging one, and some people might say, well, I disagree with that because I think we're going to be living much longer. We're going to solve some of these. We'll solve aging as a disease, and we'll think about it completely differently. So I'm really hopeful that the readers of the book actually deconstruct the stories and come up with their own ideas about what the alternatives might be.
Do you have any particular suggestions for the readers on how they use this to be more proactive and kind of construct better futures for themselves?
Well, as I say in the conclusion of the book, I do see the book as being a primer text, an introductory to people who might be interested in thinking differently about the futures. And I think there are some simple steps that they can certainly take to build on what's here. As I said, the very first thing is just simply to challenge the stories and say, well, what are the assumptions that this writer has made? And do I agree with them or not? And if I don't agree with them, do I have evidence to support an alternative scenario? And I also suggest some basic introduction to how to think like a futurist, to start looking beyond their typical resources, to do some horizon scanning on their own, and to begin to think about how they might build their own personal scenarios. For me, for people who aren't working in the profession on a daily basis, I think the idea of approaching the future from a very personal point of view is a great way to start the journey. And so that's why I focus very much on how do you think about your future and what's some evidence you can find to support or disprove some of the things you would believe would be your preferred future.
And what about you? In addition to this book, what things, and I assume there are such things, that you are doing to steer us all towards a more optimistic view of the future?
Well, in all of my work, I am unabashedly optimistic. And when I say that, I don't mean off the handle Jetsons optimistic. In fact, I was rereading Future Shock by Alvin Toffler just the other day, and there was a reference in one of his books to the idea of creating practopias, not utopias, not dystopias, but sort of practically optimistic visions of the future. So anytime I work with a client, I tell them up front, that's really what I'm interested in helping them imagine. And I don't deny that we have problems we have to solve, but I'm more interested in finding those solutions. Beyond the work, there are a couple of groups that I think are doing some interesting work in expanding the conversation around the futures. One of them you may be familiar with. It's a meetup, international meetup called Speculative Futures. We've started a chapter here in Orlando, Florida, and it is a fairly eclectic group of designers and futurists and people from a variety of different backgrounds who are bringing different tools to having conversations about the future. And those tend to be, I think, fairly optimistic conversations. And then the third thing that I'll just mention quickly is I'm actually working on a project right now with some folks who do community engagement and community dialogue across the state of Florida. And of course, any community conversation is really a conversation about the future. So one of the things I'm interested in doing is finding ways that we can sprinkle some of our foresight techniques into those conversations so that they're a little more robust in terms of thinking about positive and being aware of negative possibilities as well.
And finally, what recommendations do you have for our listeners, your readers, for everyone on how we might together create a more optimistic view of the future that maybe will bring us to a better future?
Well, like I said, I think it's important that we begin to spread the practice of foresight beyond the professionals. I mean, we obviously play a role, and there's an important part in what we do. And corporations, I think, understand why the practice is so important. We're seeing more and more corporations engage with the future. I think it's important that we think about it at a local level and a community level. And I think what would be really interesting for me is to do some of the things that I think other futurists like Peter Bishop and folks like him have been working on for a long time, to make futures a part of the ongoing educational conversation so that we expect everybody to have some of these capacities. I think it would make for a better world.
Joe, thanks so much for your time. Congratulations on the great work on the book. And of course, keep up the work on an optimistic future.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I enjoyed talking with you.
I highly recommend Reimagining Our Tomorrows, especially if you're one of those people who's stuck on that apocalyptic view of the future. And if you'd like to interact with Joe and his Foresight community online, look for his Optimistic Futurist page on Facebook. Looking towards Seeking Delphi's future, one area where Joe is possibly not optimistic enough is in the area of radical longevity extension. If you've been listening to some of my previous podcasts on the subject, you'll know that Aubrey de Grey and David Wood think it's possible within the next 20 years, not the 50-year time frame cited by Joe. And to that end, my next podcast will be with Keith Comito of the Life Extension Advocacy Foundation to preview the upcoming Ending Age-Related Diseases Conference to be held July 11th and 12th in New York City. As always, you can subscribe to Seeking Delphi on Apple Podcasts, Player FM, or YouTube, and you can follow us on Facebook. Web links relevant to today's interview can be found on the web at www.seekingdelphi.com. Thanks to Joe Tankersly and to you for joining me. My technical assistant is Mohammed Maroof. Until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.